Good evening to you all. My name is Declan Marmion. I am the Dean of Theology and the editor of this journal, the Irish Theological Quarterly. The banner you see behind me, and the reason that banner is there is because the Irish Theological Quarterly have sponsored this lecture. We're delighted to be able to welcome Professor Elisheva Baumgarten from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Dr. Jonathan Carney will give her a more extended introduction in a few moments. But my own little brief this evening is to, if you like, plug our journal. And one of the reasons to plug the Irish Theological Quarterly is because we regularly accept articles from historians, from medievalists, especially when they're focusing on a theological or religious perspective. So my aim here is not to draw your attention to the existence of the journal, number one, which has been around since 1906, I think was the original date, and also to encourage you and your colleagues to consider submitting a piece if you're working on a particular area of research, or maybe one of your doctoral or postgraduate students is working on a particular area that might fit into this journal. Typically we take articles of around 8,000 words in length, so that will be including footnotes, and we get quite a number of contributors from North America, from Australia, and increasingly so from the UK, so and Ireland. So we're always looking for good scholarly articles. In our next issue we have Peter Brown, who delivered a lecture here last year, the Dublin lecture, who will be contributing to it. We've had the likes of David Lumscombe, Timothy Bartlett next year, and a few years ago Caroline Walker-Bynum. So we have quite some luminaries there, and we would, as I say, encourage you to consider publishing yourself in the journal. Now, everybody likes to get something free. I'm going to give you out a little card on the Irish Theological Quarterly. So when you get this card, it has the website of the journal, itq.sagepub.com. Sage Publications in Great Britain are our publishers, and they kindly will offer you a 30-day free trial. So you'll be able to download a number of articles for free as you wish. So without further ado then, I thank you for coming to the lecture. Thank you to Professor Baumgarten for Ireland to give the lecture, and we hope that you can be kind of mini promoters and contributors as well to our lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Declan. Good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Carney, by the way, and I lecture in Jewish and Islamic Studies in DCU. Anyway, it's a very real pleasure for me to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Elisheva Baumgarten of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Elisheva is, of course, Elizabeth. Elisheva is the original. It comes to us in English as Elizabeth, for those of you who are wondering. Professor Baumgarten is a native of New York who grew up in Canada and made Aliyah to Israel during her high school years. She completed her undergraduate and postgraduate studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and her PhD, which was awarded summa cum laude, was supervised by the great Professor Robert Bonfield, who will be familiar to anybody who is interested in Jewish studies. She has held a number of academic appointments, including postdoctoral fellow in the Alice Paul Research Center for Women's Studies, University of Pennsylvania, lecturer in the Department of Jewish History and Gender Studies program, Bar Ilan University, visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and since 2013, tenured professor in the Department of Jewish History and the Department of History in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And she has been, since 2014, a member of the Israel Young Academy. Her research, which focuses on the social and religious history of the Jews of medieval Northern Europe, has been published in a number of books and chapters and articles from the year 2000. She's also presented her research at a number of international conferences, and it would be invidious to pick out individual items. Her bibliography is so extensive. Professor Baumgarten is, and I don't think I'm alone in holding this view, one of the most refreshing and interesting voices in contemporary Jewish studies. It's a very real privilege to be able to welcome a scholar of such stature in Ireland, where Jewish studies as a discrete discourse is still in its infancy, but we're doing what we can. Also, I don't think it's inappropriate, given the context, to mention that I had the pleasure of reviewing Professor Baumgarten's most recent book, Practicing Piety in Medieval Ashkenaz, Men, Women and Everyday Religious Observance, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, 2014, for the Irish Theological Quarterly. This is a magisterial book, and I think it is destined to become a classic in its field. It's essential reading for anybody who's interested in the history of medieval Europe, the history of religion, popular religion, Jewish studies. I could go on. In this age, I suppose, of the dissolution of disciplinary boundaries, it is a truly interdisciplinary book. Again, I would say it's also fascinating because Professor Baumgarten brings to her study of Jewish history a very sophisticated theoretical methodology that brings Jewish studies, and indeed social history, into dialogue with feminist theory, allowing us to look inter alia into the lives of the lives and the world of the doubly othered, I think, in medieval Europe, Jewish women. Again, but not solely limited to that. So, Shalom Aleichem, Uvaruka Haba'a Le'Irland, Erev Tov, Elisheva, Ani Rotzeh Lahodot Lech Al Chalok HaChochma Shelech Etanu Hayom. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our honoured guest, Professor Elisheva Baumgarten.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I really have to say that this was a wonderful invitation. When I received Salvador Ryan's email some months ago, I was very, very excited to be able to come here. I've never been to Ireland before, and since I got here yesterday, I've been busy saying how similar Ireland is to Israel, except for the weather. So it really is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank all of you for coming to hear me. I want to thank Dr. Jonathan Kearney for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank the Irish Theological Quarterly for sponsoring my visit, and above all, Salvador Ryan, who was really a bibliographic buddy. I think we all have so many of them now because of academia.edu and email and all of these different kind of international opportunities to meet people, and now has become someone who I know. And since he contacted me, he's done with so much care and worry about every detail of my stay. So it really is a true pleasure to be here and to be a guest tonight. Thank you very much. Like Adam and Eve, like Abraham and Sarah, biblical models in Jewish daily life in medieval Christian Europe. So I want to start with a poem that appears in a Jewish ritual book. And in the meantime, if you don't have a handout, you might want to take care of getting a handout. That will be needed in a few moments, not quite yet, but you should have it perhaps in front of you. So may God bless this groom and bride as he blessed the heavens and earth. May God bless this groom and bride as he blessed the sun and the moon. May he bless them with love and companionship as he blessed Adam and Eve. May God bless them with everything and with no absence as he blessed Abraham and Sarah. May he bless them with enduring faith as he blessed Isaac and Rebekah. May he bless them with full fruit of the womb as he blessed Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. May he bless them with the glory of the siren as he blessed Moses and Zipporah. And the poem goes on. I stopped copying it here. This poem appears in Mahzor Vitry, a northern French 12th century compendium written by Rabbi Simcha of Vitry, a student of the famous biblical commentator Rashi. Featured among a number of liturgical poems recited for the bridegroom in the synagogue as he assumed ritual roles during the prayer services on the Sabbath after his wedding. It calls on many famous biblical couples that are meant to serve as an inspiration for the couple getting married. In truth, I'm not doing this poem justice. We have to imagine it being called out and responded to, and the whole community taking part. This poem may seem to you at first quite unremarkable. what, one could ask, is more predictable than having medieval Jews call on their biblical predecessors when blessing the young couples within the community? Yet, as I will argue in the minutes that follow, this poem is in many ways an exception within literature penned by medieval Jewish rabbis that has reached us. Moreover, for my purposes today, it will serve as an entry point to a topic that I believe has been sorely neglected today: the importance of the Bible for studying the practices and beliefs of medieval Jews in Northern Europe. My talk will be divided into three distinct parts. Knowing that many of you, although fellow medievalists, do not study medieval Judaism, I will first provide a brief introduction to the communities I will be discussing. I will then outline what medieval Jews knew about the Bible and how the Bible figured in their daily lives and practices, returning to this wedding poem to provide some examples. The third and longest part of my talk will focus on two specific examples that appear in my title. I will seek to demonstrate how attention to the ways medieval Jews read the Bible and indeed reinterpreted it can help underline and explain aspects of tensions and practices in daily life and religious beliefs. My two examples will be Abraham and Eve. So I'm doing an injustice to Adam and Sarah, but perhaps I can talk about them in the question and answer. In fact, a longer study could perhaps do justice to all of the figures mentioned in the poem, and I just want to point out this little picture here, because when I read this poem for the first time, I was most surprised about Moses and Zipporah. Somehow they really knocked me out, until I realized that the illustration of a Jewish wedding that I use for all my talks, in which I talk about marriage, is this picture, and that in the manuscript it says, this is Moses and this is Zipporah. And this has become the standard illustration we all use as medievalists who study Jewish culture for a wedding. So it was just really interesting to see them there, and that's why they're here in my PowerPoint now. So those are Moses and Zipporah, as imagined by some Jewish compiler of that book. Since what you are hearing today is a work in progress, I invite both critique of my argument as well as any comparative reflections I can gain from your expertise in other aspects of medieval culture. And I believe that although some of the texts I am working on may be foreign to you, based on what I have heard over the past 2 days, many of the questions we have in common. So let me start. My research focuses on the Jews of medieval Northern Europe, known from the 9th and 10th centuries when they began to settle in different places in northern France, in Prague, as well as along the Rhine River in Germany. The medieval Jewish communities of Northern Europe were small, certainly in contrast to the larger and more ancient Jewish communities in Italy and in Iberia. The Jews who reached Northern Europe settled within the growing urban commercial centers, at least initially by invitation of local and regional rulers. Small in number around the year 1000, by 1300, hundreds of Jewish communities, ranging from a handful of Jews to dozens of families, existed. What you see here are two maps. I don't really need you to see what it says. I just need you to see the difference between the two of them. What you see on the far side are the Jews in the Rhineland area around the year 1000, and those are only the cities where there were Jews, or the places where there were Jews marked on the map. And what you see here is already around 1300. So you can see how many Jewish communities sprung up in just this one area of Germany during this period. And of course, this picture changes drastically, and that is something I won't be talking about tonight, but I do feel the need to mention. After 1350, all those marks you see there are places where the Jews were persecuted or expelled during the first half of the 14th century, mainly culminating in the Black Death, so mid-century. So that is just to say that in the period after the one I'm discussing tonight, things changed drastically, which is why I usually say my research stops around the Black Death, because of the big change then. So we've just seen how the communities have expanded during the period I'll be focusing on, which is really the 12th and 13th century. Now, the other thing that's very important to say by way of introduction is that the Jews during the Middle Ages all over, but certainly in Northern Europe, did not live in a ghetto or even in a separate neighborhood. They were parts of the cities they inhabited. There was a Juiverie, there was a Rue de Juifs, there was a Jewish area, but those streets were populated by non-Jews as well. And if you look at this map of medieval Speyer, just to give you one example, you can see how close the cathedral and the synagogue were. That is typical of almost every northern medieval city. The Jews lived in the center of town, very close to the main markets, the main places of commerce. And Speyer is a great example because when the Jews were welcomed into Speyer at the end of the 10th century, they were actually situated, they were told they were being given land up there in the top of that map in a separate quarter. The Jews never lived there. They lived in the center of the city from the start. So the last word of introduction I have to say in this part is that the northern communities, or the northern Jewish communities of Europe are often called by a general name, which is Ashkenaz. So when we talk about the Ashkenazic custom, we're talking about the custom that came from there. There's some quibbling between scholars. Is Ashkenaz Germany? Is it northern France and Germany? Is it northern France, Germany, and England? You'll be hearing me use it in both ways tonight, so you'll forgive me for not being quite as exact. But when we say Ashkenaz, we usually mean the entire area. So these Jews, their history, and their cultural oeuvre are best known through a number of specific channels. One of them is literary production. The rabbis of northern France, and by extension those of England and of Germany, produced volumes of biblical and Talmudic commentaries. In addition, these same Jews penned books of customs and commandments that detailed Jewish ritual. They wrote many liturgical poems that became integrated into the liturgy, and they responded in writing to numerous inquiries concerning legal and ritual procedure, in a body of literature usually known as shut, she'elot v'tshuvot, in English simply responsa, or questions and answers. In addition to the production of compositions that serve to clarify practical and theological aspects of Jewish life, medieval Jews in Northern Europe are famous for the chronicles they penned that told their history in times of catastrophe. And perhaps the most famous event are the event of 1096, when the first Crusaders, on their way to the Holy Land, attacked the Jewish communities, mainly in the Rhineland, in those communities I showed you before. Historians have focused especially on the legal responsa and on the custom books as a channel for understanding medieval life and practice. Only very recently has it been acknowledged that although very rich in detail, these sources reflect the higher learned echelons of Jewish society far more than they relate to most members of the communities. A second group of sources that can be found and through which Jews have been studied are in Latin. They are studied through religious literature written for both internal Christian purposes and for polemic contacts between Jews and Christians. These texts, in Latin, and we have some parallels in Hebrew, recount intellectual encounters between learned Jews and Christians, the theological competition between them, and the tolerance and intolerance of Europe's major religious minority. The High Middle Ages are characterized by a growing animosity towards Jews that resulted in public debates, attempts to convert the Jews that both failed and succeeded, especially over the course of the 13th century, as well as expulsions and persecutions. Both these channels, the Hebrew and the Latin, have privileged the writings and perspectives of the elite religious leaders of the community, as well as extreme events that underline moments of crisis and change. I want to note also that we have almost no archival documentation that has survived, except for a very few sources. Lately, I've been doing some work on the tax records of Paris from the late 13th century. So that's perhaps one example of the kind of documented practice that survives, but for Northern Europe, we have almost no archives with mentions of the Jews. So my work over the past years, and probably in the years to come as well, is focused at getting beyond this elite, Jewish or Christian, beyond those people who wrote the sources we have, to a wider assortment of members of the community. As a scholar who began her work with an interest in women and gender, I have gradually moved towards expanding the circle of those who were not part of the elite. Undoubtedly, in many instances, there may not have been a great distance between the writers of the Hebrew texts that have reached us and the members of the Jewish community who could not have written such elaborate or complicated texts. However, at the same time, the Hebrew texts are on the whole prescriptive rather than descriptive, and they have been mined by scholars for ideology rather than practice or belief. Put differently, in terms that all of us are familiar with, I am seeking medieval Jewish lay belief and practice, lived experience. And that is perhaps a better way to define the daily life that appeared in my title. Although it is not rare for scholars of medieval Jewish society to turn to questions that have already been posed and answered by scholars who studied the majority culture, Christian culture, there is also an ideological reason for not asking this question among some. Scholars have assumed a cohesiveness of the medieval Jewish communities that as of late has been called into question as more and more local studies have been conducted. So too, as the main texts being examined were written by the community leaders, the assumption was that all members of the different communities followed them. Everyone listened to the rabbi. And that is a premise that I think is worth questioning. As a key, or perhaps one could say a hook to my inquiry, to discover what a broader segment of the Jewish community than those who could write and discuss the Talmud and other questions of medieval Jewish law known as halacha, I stumbled upon the Bible, and specifically biblical stories and key figures within them some years ago. Why do I say stumbled? Because the Bible is a problematic source for two interconnected central reasons. You can see here, you can see here a picture of King David from a Hebrew miscellany from the 13th century. Those of you who are historians of Christian art will probably say that it looks fairly familiar, right? Very much like what a Christian artist would have drawn, and probably a Jew went to the Christian artist and commissioned this picture, giving that Christian artist some instructions how to change it so it won't look too Christian and it will look Jewish. But what you can see underlying this, and that is why I brought this picture right now, is that the Jews shared the Bible with their Christian neighbors. So while there are differences between Jewish and Christian interpretation, there's also joint learning and shared ideas. There's overt and covert polemic within Jewish and Christian commentaries. And the medieval Jews, as heirs of the late antique Jewish culture, were people of the book. They read the Bible in synagogue regularly, studied it, and focused on it in sermons and liturgy. But despite this, Jewish daily life was determined by the laws written in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and added to by generations of rabbis. The Talmud, rather than the Bible, was the basis of Jewish legal rulings and practical directions. This is not to disconnect them from one another, but if the Talmud rules contrary to the Bible or limits the understanding of the Bible, the Talmudic dictum is always accepted. As Amos Finkelstein argued some years ago, medieval Christian critics of Judaism voiced this very same accusation against the Jews. You aren't people of the book anymore. You're people of the Talmud, and therefore perhaps you should not be tolerated as you were before as people of the book. That is a 13th century argument. As a result, the Bible, or really what I mean is the medieval exegesis and interpretation of the Bible, is not instinctively an obvious site to look for medieval Jewish practice. Moreover, when historians have looked to legal response and custom books, they often ignore the biblical references within these books. And they completely neglect exegesis as a source for any kind of medieval practice and thought beyond the circles of elite scholars. As Susan Einbinder, who I'll be mentioning later tonight, said in her work, when discussing liturgical poems that were written in medieval Ashkenaz that often drew heavily on rabbinic and biblical Hebrew, she says the audience capable of deciphering these texts of poetry, and I would extend this to most medieval Hebrew texts, remains more or less consistent. Male, highly literate graduates of the Tosafist schools of northern France and Ashkenaz. Therefore, the Bible has been almost completely overlooked except in this very kind of complicated way. But what I would like to argue is that in contrast to the legal text, to the liturgy, to all these complicated texts that Susan is talking about, written by the elite, the Bible was well known to medieval Jews, men, women, and children. It was read every Sabbath and was part of many of the tales that were used for sermons, and even as we saw above, in a simple liturgical poem. Most Jewish men and a significant number of Jewish women were named for biblical figures. Medieval epitaphs contain references to biblical characters, and moral literature calls on biblical characters as examples. In general, medieval Jews often compared between their lives and those of biblical figures, drawing close connections between episodes in the Bible and medieval events. Maybe the most famous of them is that when trying to explain the attacks on the Jewish community during the First Crusade, the argument was that the medieval Jews were actually paying the price for the sin of the golden calf. So scholars of medieval Jewish history have not looked at the Bible enough. They also have hardly looked at stories as a source for cultural and social history. Many of the stories Jews told were centuries old. If not from the Bible, then from the Talmud. So what can one learn about medieval life from these stories? But this convention has been changing over recent years, and my work joins that of others who are gradually paying more and more attention to the story medieval Jews told, whether those related to the Bible or otherwise. In some of my recent work, I have examined stories that originate in antiquity and have suggested that insight have been gained by looking at the way the stories were retold, amended, and expanded. And this will be my method of operation today as well. So if I sum up this introduction to medieval Jewish culture, to recent scholarship, and the place of the Bible and stories within it, I want to note one final tension. And this, I think, has been the most productive tension within the field of medieval Jewish European history, but also one of the most contentious issues. How can one distinguish between what is Jewish and Christian if we're saying that medieval Jews were borrowing from their surroundings, were part of their surroundings? What will be related to the past, to antiquity, and what will be shared and medieval? When studying lay culture and daily life, this question is paramount. If I just mention two titles of books that have been very popular over the past years, one is Ken Stowe's Alienated Minority. So in his book, we have the Jews as an alienated group within the majority culture of Christian Europe. The other is Jonathan Alukin's Living Together, Living Apart, in which he swung the pendulum in the other direction completely, claiming that Jews and Christians were really the same. They had the same beliefs, they lived in the same material settings, and really what was the difference between them? So how do we find a balance between these different tensions? And the Bible, of course, makes this all the more problematic because it belonged to both cultures. So now that I have provided this introduction, let us return to the liturgical poem from the wedding with which I began. The poem is exceptional in its simplicity, and those who sang it, the members of the Jewish community, most of whom we can safely assume were in the synagogue, probably understood most of it. I say this despite the fact that medieval Jews did not speak Hebrew on a daily basis. They spoke the local vernacular. It became Yiddish afterwards, but at first it was just Mittelhochdeutsch. And in northern France, they also spoke the languages that were spoken around them. Some people call it Hebraico-French because we have a kind of French that you can find in Hebrew letters. Interestingly, most liturgical poems from the wedding ritual were far more complex in their imagery and difficult to understand than this poem. So this poem was really an exception to the rule and not the rule, and actually it was surprising when I found it within the compendium. Our poem, in contrast, would have been understood even by a child who just knew the basics of the book of Genesis and Exodus. In some ways, it reminds one of a litany of calling upon saints or biblical figures by name. And these same biblical figures have been overlooked in some cases as they serve as important figures when explaining ritual practices, and in some cases even validating customs. This is not new in the Middle Ages, but the reasoning sometimes changes. In other words, medieval commentators will call on a different biblical figure in order to explain what they're doing. So one famous example that predates the medieval period but becomes all the more important then is Abraham. Medieval Jews attached tremendous importance to the circumcision ritual. Now, the circumcision ritual, of course, was practiced for generations and for centuries before the Middle Ages. But in the Middle Ages in Northern Europe, this was a ceremony that underlined Jewish difference. The deep meaning Jews found in circumcision is evident, for example, in the Hebrew Chronicles, written after 1096. When they are describing the attack on the Rhineland Jewish communities, the non-Jews are called the Arelim, the uncircumcised, and the Jews are called the members of the covenant, Bnei Brit. So the story of Abraham as the first circumcised Jew, who circumcised his son, is used to explain elements of the ritual. Just like Abraham rose early in the morning to fulfill God's commandment, so too a circumcision ritual was supposed to take place during the day, and preferably first thing in the morning. Now these types of explanation, we're all familiar with them from medieval texts, and they sound very run-of-the-mill. But it is worth noting how many practical features of mundane Jewish ritual life are based on these sorts of cross-references. And as historians, it's perhaps even more important to note when these proof texts are ignored or fail to have any more importance, or when they're called upon and reinvented. So what you see here is a picture of Isaac's circumcision, and it looks very medieval. It was made in early 14th century Germany, and actually I have studied this picture and I've demonstrated the clothing the women are wearing here is very fashionable clothing for that period. So you can actually learn a lot about contemporary customs just by looking at this picture. And this picture shows the women standing at the entrance to the synagogue and two men performing the ritual. That might look obvious, but this comes at a time when the rabbis are ruling furiously against women holding the baby during the circumcision ceremony. So actually this picture is sending home a message to anyone who would want a woman to be sitting in that place and saying the women, they stop at the door. And then the men, they are the ones who will perform the ritual. Why? Like Abraham. God commanded him, not her. So we also let him, not her. So that's just one example of that kind of ritual. Another famous example of a biblical story retold and reinterpreted by medieval Jews that is a model for the two examples I will share with you today is the research conducted by Shalom Spiegel in the 60s. This research is concerned with the binding of Isaac. As anyone who reads the Bible knows, Isaac was not sacrificed by his father. He was bound. At the last moment, in the nick of time, an angel stopped Abraham from slaughtering his son, and a ram was substituted for the human sacrifice. In Christianity, of course, this story gains a different resonance, as Isaac is seen as a prefiguration of Jesus, who is a martyr par excellence. Among the Jews of late antiquity, this distinction was emphasized, allowing the Jewish narrative to be a very different one from the Christian narrative. This distinction changes in the medieval Jewish reinterpretation of the Isaac narrative. Shalom Spiegel detailed a new version of the tale of Isaac's binding that was told by medieval Jews after 1096 in Germany. During the attacks on the Jewish community, some Jews converted to Christianity, but those who were thereafter most firmly inscribed in Jewish collective memory committed suicide, and parents actually killed their children, preferring death to conversion to Christianity. As Spiegel details, these Jews called upon Abraham and explained that, like him, they were sacrificing their sons. The result of this was a new understanding of the biblical story that was an extension, but not a reflection of the Bible. This new story was that Abraham actually slaughtered Isaac, and the angel came down and brought Isaac back to life. And this became so affixed in Jewish exegesis and finally made its way to Christian exegesis, as can be seen, for example, in Kierkegaard's writings. Yet martyrdom, even among medieval Jews, was not a common phenomenon. In fact, the response to the 1096 persecutions that was almost silenced in the medieval Hebrew chronicles was probably far more the norm: conversion. And now I want to turn to my first story about Abraham. We are going to look at this story and look at some parallels from other Hebrew texts and from some Latin texts. As will be evident, this is not just a medieval story. Late antique foundations play an important role alongside the contemporary medieval Christianity. And the play between the diachronic and synchronic is part of what, for me, makes the study so interesting and challenging. The story I want to tell you is known in Jewish culture as Abraham in the furnace. Quick raise of hands, how many of you have heard of Abraham in the furnace? Okay, if I asked that question in a first grade, in any Jewish day school around the world, all the hands would be up. So this became part of medieval Jewish culture. And what I gave you on the handout is actually the end of that story. I'm going to tell the beginning, because we don't have so much time, and then we'll have a look at the end, which is what I really want to focus on. So you can have that in your hand as I start telling you the story. So the Abraham narrative in Genesis begins with a description of Abraham's paternal family. While detailing his father's and grandfather's wandering in Mesopotamia, let me just find my copy here so I can go along with you. Just one second. Well, I think I can do without it. Where did I put it? I'm sorry. Thank you very much. So, while detailing his grandfather and father's wanderings in Mesopotamia, it is stated, and if you look here at the two verses I brought, when Terach had lived it is stated, verse 28, and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And then verse 31, and Terach took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. Now, there's one word or one phrase that repeats itself in these two verses, and that is Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Twice we have this mentioned. And based on this, already in the book of Nehemiah, we can see, you are the Lord the God who chose Abram and brought him forth out of Ur of the Chaldees and gave him the name of Abraham. So perhaps the tale I'm about to tell you has its origins already far back in antiquity. According to this tale, Abraham rebelled against his father Terach. He destroyed all of his father's idols. He actually broke them down and smashed them. And then he was brought before the mighty king of the time, Nimrod. Nimrod had Abraham cast into a fiery furnace. God himself descended and saved Abraham from this ordeal. Up until this point, the story is told briefly in late antique versions, as well as in other medieval compilations. But, as has been demonstrated, this story was especially popular in medieval Germany and northern France, and disseminated from there to North Africa in the early modern period. Already in this fact, we can find the martyrological culture that was typical of medieval northern European Judaism in the post-Crusade period. But what I want to do with you is turn to a medieval northern French version of this story, where one can see an evident and very large addition, and what you have in your handout is actually the addition, what was added on in this 13th century version. In the 13th century manuscript from Champagne, the Oxford Bodleian Library, or 135, Oriental 135, the story appears in two separate collections of Hebrew stories. It is almost an identical version, so I will refer only to one of them, and I will focus on the one that appears in a book known as Sefer HaMaasim. Maaseh means story, and any of you who can read Hebrew can see that word up there on the PowerPoint, the big Maaseh. So each story in this compilation, which contains 66 stories, starts with that big word Maaseh, and you can see it beautifully in the manuscript throughout. You'll see why that's important in a minute. About a fifth of the stories in Sefer HaMaasim are based on biblical stories. And Maaseh means once upon a time, and the Abraham story concludes Abraham experiences with what you have on your handout. What did they do? They fueled the furnace for 7 days and 7 nights and threw Abraham into the furnace. At once the angels cried out to God. And I'm here in the middle of what's noted as A here on the handout. Let us go and save this righteous one from the furnace. And they argued amongst themselves, with one saying, I will go down, and the other saying, I will go down. And all the gods, the angels, argue between them until God says, I will go down myself. And God himself, on the last line of that part, in all his glory, immediately went down and saved him from the furnace's fire. This is where the story ends. However, in Sefer HaMaasim, something very strange happens that doesn't usually happen. I don't know if you can see this from where you are. Instead of moving on to the next story, another story is immediately appended to the story. This is really rare because each story is really quite discrete. And what the copyist does, and I circled that there, and those of you who read Hebrew can see it, he adds the word also, ve'af, and then starts a story, another story about a fiery furnace, that of Mishael, Azariah, and Hananel in the fiery furnace from the book of Daniel, or as they are known in Christian culture, and I hope I say this right, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who survived the furnace into which Nebuchadnezzar had thrown them. And you can see that story there on the continuation of the handout. This is followed by an epilogue to which I will turn momentarily. But first let us see how these two narratives fit within each other. Some parts of it are obvious, because we can see the connection of the furnace and not burning in the furnace, and it's clear why they go together. But if we go back to the history of this story, we'll see that the story about Abraham is actually already defined by Jerome as a Hebrew story. And here I assume most of you can read the Latin, in which Jerome notices here on the side of the gloss that Ur Kasdim, the word Ur, meaning fire, is actually the fire of the Chaldeans. And according to a Hebrew story, that's what he says, the Jews believe that Abraham was thrown into this fire. What am I trying to tell you? I'm trying to tell you that this is a Jewish story. Jerome says it's a Jewish story. The glossa tells us it's a Jewish story. So this is known as a Jewish story. However, if you think of the story of Abraham in the furnace, it actually seems that it's far more Christian than Jewish. Why, in medieval terms? First of all, it describes an ordeal, a trial by fire. This was a known technique of judgment during the High Middle Ages, certainly in the 12th and up till the 13th century. As Robert Bartlett has shown us, this is a Christian practice that was prohibited when judging Jews. Moreover, already the earliest known privilege granted to Jews specified that Jews would not be tried by fire. So from the perspective of everyday life, Jews would actually not find so much resonance in a story about a trial by fire in their everyday lives. Indeed, Shlomo Eidelberg, argued in his article on ordeals and Jews that ordeals were foreign to medieval Jews. And he quotes one text from the mid-12th century in which the Jews mock Christians who believe in ordeals. A second connection to medieval Christian practice can be seen not in the human trial by fire, but in the testing of relics that was common in medieval Europe, especially in Ottonian Germany. As Thomas Head has demonstrated, trial by fire for relics was quite common. Head outlined the ritual celebrated during such events in the Inventio. When a relic was tested, all members of the relevant community fasted for 3 days. As part of an all-filled procession, the relic was then tested and burned, and if it didn't burn, it was declared holy, the Te Deum was sung, and celebration was begun. The liturgy from these rituals called on the 3 youth from the book of Daniel as a kind of proof for this invention and this test by fire. Such rituals were common in the areas where Jews lived, for example in medieval Trier, where in 979 the figure of Saint Eggebert was tested, and then again in the 12th century when the holy robe of Jesus was recognized as a relic. This relic can still be seen in Trier today. Stories of this type of Christian holiness troubled medieval Jews, who sometimes felt hard-pressed to recognize the sanctity of Christian miracles. How could you deny a miracle like this if you saw it? And if we look at this short story from Sefer Hasidim, a late 12th century compilation of Hebrew moral tales from the Rhineland, we can see a hint to this reality, and I'll just try to explain this story. This story comes as a comment on a verse from Proverbs. I'm going to skip that for the moment, and says as follows. It happened that a non-Jew brought a robe and told the other non-Jews that this was Jesus Christ's robe. He said, "If you do not believe me, look what I will do." He threw the robe into the fire, and it did not burn. The monks and the priests said to the Jews, "Now you know that there is holiness in the robe." The Jewish sage said, "Give it to me, and I will show you what it contains." He took strong vinegar and soap. That brings us back to Proverbs. That's why this is a commentary on Proverbs. Washed the robe in vinegar in front of their eyes and said, "Throw it in the fire and test it." And they threw it in the fire, and it burned. They said to him, "Why did you think to launder it?" He said, "Because it was smeared with salamander, and I had to wash it." Now this is of course an imaginary encounter between Jews and Christians. The rabbi who wrote this probably used it as a sermon in the synagogue. But it tells us how troubling this rabbi and his community members found the miracles Christians reported were happening. It also, I think, hints to a local story. Because when we read Judah the Pious's story, he's the author of this story, we see many different local elements. I have gone through lists and lists of medieval relics. A robe related to Jesus is not a common one. We have 2 places that claim this robe, one of them being in Trier. Samuel moved in his life from Speyer to Regensburg. Trier was pretty close by, and I would almost bet that he heard the story of the robe in Trier, and that's why this is the relic he's discussing in his story. In any case, one could ask here, how did a Jew know of these things? The written texts we have don't tell of close communications between Jews and Christians. What I'm trying to argue is that we have to listen to the voices. Jews and Christians talk to each other on a daily basis. And therefore, Jews found trial by fire really quite perplexing. So when they heard these stories, they had to process the information they learned. Let's go back to where we were a few moments ago. I was discussing Abraham in the furnace. All these proof texts have nothing to do with the story of Abraham in the furnace. But I have brought them to make the popularity of the story of Abraham in the furnace somewhat illogical, but perhaps also logical. Trial by fire, as well as invention of relics, were Christian practices. Moreover, the second story that is somewhat surprisingly added on here, that of the 3 youth from the book of Daniel, was referred to far more often by Christians than by medieval Jews. The 3 youth from the book of Daniel were also important among Christians in medieval Ireland, I learned when preparing to come here. And I don't have an image of that, but I learned that there are many medieval high crosses that have that image on them, and I'd be really interested to hear some more about that. I just read one article by Colm Hurahan in a book about medieval Irish art. So the combination between the Abraham and the Daniel tradition is found almost only in the manuscripts from medieval Ashkenaz. So I am proposing that in order to understand the way the medieval Jews of Northern Europe chose to retell this story, can tell us about the ideas that were exchanged between Jews and Christians, probably learned ones, but also about ideas and beliefs that were shared by Jews and Christians on a much more popular level. How did the Jewish ideas reach the Christians? Although one cannot point to direct contact, I can pinpoint Peter Comestor's Historia Scholastica, where he tells the story of Abraham in the furnace. Thereafter, we can document how the story spread to Christian writings, and what you have here are illustrations of this story in the Speculum Humanae Salvationis that was quite popular in the late Middle Ages. And I want you to look at these three scenes because we'll be coming back to this art in a moment. So here's one. This is Abraham in the fire. Here's another of Abraham in the fire. And here's a third. These are all 14th and 15th century versions of the Speculum. In addition, I have also found a few manuscripts that feature King Nimrod and his worship of fire, and you can see it there up in the corner. So they echo the Jewish tradition, if only partially. So now let us return to the story as told by the Jews and connect this story to lay belief and practice. The story of Abraham in the furnace was a popular one in Jewish culture well before the Middle Ages and in different diasporas. In medieval Ashkenaz, it was linked with the story of the three boys from the book of Daniel. But if we move from books to historical events, let us turn to Blois in 1171. The Blois Fair is the first ritual murder accusation, at the end of which a number of Jews, men, women, and children are burnt at stake. As Susan Einbinder already argued, the way the Jews recounted this event from Blois demonstrates the extent to which the Jews of Blois had appropriated Christian beliefs concerning trial by fire. 8 poems, as well as multiple prose accounts, exist for this episode, and 4 of the poems underline the trial by fire the Jews underwent and initially survived. And I brought one part of a prose account to show you what they tell. And this is what is said. Then the count, the foe, commanded that they bring them, the rabbis, and put them in a wooden building and surround the building with brush and bundles of kindling. When they brought them outside, they said to them, "Save your souls by leaving your God and turning to us." And he commanded to take 2 priests of righteousness, and the reason they're called priests is because they're Kohanim. They come from priestly descendant, not because they're priests in any kind of Christian way. They're rabbis, Rabbi Yechiel ben David HaKohen, and the other one, Rabbi Yekutiel, and they tied them to a single stake in the burning building, and both were men of valor. I'm skipping 2 lines. Then they ignited the kindling and the fire caught, and they severed the bonds about their hands. And the 3 of them came out, so they survived this fire. And they say to the Christian, "Behold, the fire has no power over us. Why cannot we go free?" Then they say to them, "Not in your lives will you get out of this." But they struggle to get out. Then they return them again to the fire. And the account has the Christian saying, "These are saints. They're surviving the fire." And it was written that when the flames rose, they lifted up their voice in song. And they, the Christians, came and said to us, "What is that song of yours? For we have never heard a song like this." Then we all knew it was Aleinu L'Shabeach. Now, I have to explain. Aleinu L'Shabeach is a Jewish prayer that's said 3 times a day. Scholars have compared it to the Te Deum. And they've actually shown a parallel between that to the Te Deum. And I want to go back to the invention, the ritual of the Inventio I talked about before, where the Te Deum was also sung after the relic survived the burning. So we can really see some kind of similarity here and an appropriation of medieval practice. The last line of argument I want to suggest to you, because I'm almost done with argument with Abraham, and Eve will be much, much shorter. The last line of argument I want to suggest to you is a visual one. When drawing the scene of the 3 boys in the furnace, I want you to have a look at that furnace there. Can you see the furnace? This is from the same medieval Hebrew manuscript I showed you before with King David. So this is a picture of the 3 boys in the fiery furnace. And this is how it is drawn. One would imagine Abraham would be drawn in this way too. But if you look at the way medieval Jews drew Abraham, and I'll show it to you in color here, and this is from a different Hebrew ritual book, look at Abraham over there in that fire. That's King Nimrod judging Abraham, and then Abraham is in that fire over there. I hope it rings a bell, because it looks a lot more like this than it does like a furnace. So we can even see how the way this story was visualized became similar to the methods that were used to punish the Jews, which is burning at stake, which is what was done in medieval Europe, rather than fiery furnaces. So what I'm suggesting, to sum this up, is that this story of Abraham is far more contemporary than it should have been. And now I want to look at the epilogue. If you look at the epilogue on the handout, that's C, we can see that we have an addition. Now, most stories in Sefer Maasim are supposed to be moral tales without any kind of addition. We're supposed to get the message. The other story that has a moral tale is my favorite story. It's about 2 young people who fall in love, and they manage, after fighting with their parents, to marry each other, despite the fact that it wasn't a match that the parents wanted in the beginning. And when this story ends, the copyist writes, "And the same thing that happened to them may it happen to us, amen." So that's my favorite addition. He's kind of telling his readers or his listeners, you can have romantic love, all can be well. What happened to this young couple, may it happen to us. But the other exception to that rule is this story we have before us. And what we hear here is, if you go to the 4 lines right before this, immediately all the nations praise God and thrashed and beats the people of Israel, dancing before them and saying, "With such a God you bow down to an idol?" Immediately the face of the people of Israel fell, and they struck their mouths, saying, "Lord, you are righteous, and we are covered with shame this day." Till here we have a number of manuscripts, but then they add, "God uproots anyone who worships idols, both from this world and the next, and you will see all the good that God will do for the righteous ones, and they will be ashamed and say, 'Woe unto us that we did not merit this honor, because we abandoned the living God to worship a dead one.'" Should I read that again? "Woe unto us that we did not merit this honor, because we abandoned a living God to worship a dead one. And then fire will emerge and consume all the apostates who abandoned God and did not repent." Who is at the focus of this epilogue? I would argue that the God being spoken of is not the God of Nimrod, the fire, the mythical king who threw Abraham into the furnace, nor Nebuchadnezzar, who put the 3 youth in the furnace. Rather, we can see a very real concern with the God who is an idol that people bow down to, a God who is dead, or in other words, Jesus. The epilogue is telling us that fire will emerge and consume all the apostates who abandoned God and did not repent. This is a very interesting audience. It is not aimed against conversion, although certainly someone hearing this story shouldn't convert, but rather against those who converted but did not return to Judaism. That was the real concern in the 13th century, that people were converting and not converting back. So at the moment in which Sefer Maasim was copied, conversion was a frequent phenomenon. What we see here is that the medieval copyist and amender of the text realizes this and is really talking to a double audience, both telling Jews not to convert and also urging those who converted to return to Judaism. So, if you accept my reading, what we have seen is how a careful retelling of a biblical story in its late antique form and then in its medieval form can tell us much about the lives and intentions of those who are retelling it. My next example is a little bit happier. It is the figure of Eve, also mentioned in our liturgical song for marriage. Eve is a complicated figure within Jewish tradition, and specifically within medieval Jewish tradition. Whereas medieval Christianity basically turned Eve into a negative figure, with the Virgin Mary taking her place as a cultural heroine, Jewish exegetes portray Eve ambivalently. Already from late antiquity, Eve and her deeds are brought as an explanation for women who don't behave well, and more specifically, for women's death during childbirth. Before I show you that source, I just want you to look at the line in our poem. "May he bless them with love and companionship as he blessed Adam and Eve." That is the positive side. But the negative side is what appears already in the Mishnah, and which Jews say to date every Friday night if they go to services. When I go to services, I refuse to say this Mishnah. So it says as follows: "For 3 transgressions, women die in childbirth, because they are not careful of their separation at proper periods." This is menstrual separation, menstrual purity. "They are not careful of separating the cake of the dough, when you are supposed to take a portion of the bread and put it aside. And they are not careful when lighting the lamps for the Sabbath." These 3 female responsibilities are known as the Chana commandments, mitzvot Chana, and I tried to show you why they are that there. And they are considered the commandments every woman must fulfill. And the explanation for why these are related to Eve is already in existence from the early medieval period, and they explain that Eve, in what she did, she basically did something that relates to each of these different commandments. I'm not going to go into this right now. What I do want to say is this text is frequently quoted within medieval commentaries, as well as within legal halachic tractates, to explain why women must be careful about menstrual purity, about making bread, and lighting Sabbath candles. It's a nice example of how a biblical story became connected with practice and framed the practice thereafter. However, Eve as a figure through which to explain practice has a much more complex story to tell us. The sin in the Garden of Eden and its consequences is perhaps the most central in medieval Jewish and Christian understandings of Eve. But in the marriage poem we saw, she was part of the very first couple, and every Jewish couple was blessed to resemble Adam and Eve. And this hints already that there is another side to this tradition. Adam and Eve were often referred to as an ideal couple, and their marriage in heaven is referenced in many liturgical poems much more complex than our poem. Their wedding canopy was seen as the pinnacle of any marriage, and their marriage was seen as a model. This is interesting in light of the blame put on Eve by Adam in the Bible in chapter 3. But the Jewish tradition was founded on a different verse in Genesis that was emphasized over and above the sin. And that is this verse. Immediately after God delivers his punishment to Adam and Eve, the Bible recounts, the man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all the living. Em kol chai. The rabbis depend on this verse to regulate aspects of marriage, both financial and psychological. In the Talmud, this verse is called upon to explain why if a man and his wife are from different social classes, and specifically the wife is used to more luxury than her husband can provide, he must uphold the standard in the house the wife came from. So if she would have wished to be buried in a certain manner, when she dies, he can't bury her like a pauper. He has to bury her like a rich woman if she came from a rich family. If she is used to having a wet nurse in the house she came for, he must hire a wet nurse to nurse her child and not expect her to nurse the child herself. During the 13th century, this verse was called upon for a precedent, the likes of which were not seen before. Before I explain the precedent, I want to remind you that if legal decisors had a Talmudic source, they wouldn't turn to the Bible. So clearly what is going on is the rabbis have no way to rule the way they want to rule. So they turn to the Bible because the Talmud is not satisfactory. So in 13th century Germany, we have a number of accounts in which the rabbis take up a very bad practice, wife beating. Jewish men who beat their wives, and they want to stop it. What they do in order to stop it is they call upon the precedent of Eve. And they say, Eve was the mother of all the living. Eve was supposed to live, not to suffer. And therefore, you men who beat your wives, you are doing something terrible. And they actually rule that these men must be beaten and put in jail because they are acting against Eve. So what we can see here is how Eve becomes a symbol of this model of marriage, and she is called upon as the person who one has to use or to base oneself on to treat his wife nicely. In fact, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who was one of the most famous 13th century rabbis, rules that a woman who lives in her in-laws' house and is unhappy there must be moved out because of Eve. Eve was supposed to be living in happiness and not living in sorrow, and therefore she must be moved out of that house. So if you look at the medieval texts, this reference to Eve seems perhaps tangential. But when you turn to early modern moral literature, written specifically for women, the importance of Eve and her merit, rather than her sin, are evident in a very concrete way. Early modern Yiddish texts, which are texts that are often written for women, talk about Eve as the model, pious and loving wife who deserves to be treated as such. And what I want to show you is just one practice, an actual practice that's called upon with Eve as an explanation. In the Tzena or Ena, the Yiddish Bible, read most popularly by women, they discuss the first chapters of Genesis, and they tell of a practice that was well known according to other early modern custom books. While it is likely that this practice can be documented back to the Middle Ages, it is certainly well known by the 16th century. The practice was one that was performed in the fall, at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. At the end of the holiday, a pregnant woman would take the etrog, and I gave you here a modern image of the etrog, the citron fruit that's used to make the blessings during the holiday of Tabernacles. And you can see that it has a little kind of tip there, a little kind of stem. It doesn't really have an English word. In Hebrew, it's called the pitam, that little kind of stem at the very, very end. A very good etrog is one that has a stem like that. So what does this have to do with us? At the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, pregnant women would take the citron fruit and they would bite off that pitam, that little stem. This was a known fertility charm, and it was believed that a woman who did this would have an easy and safe birth. And if you read the text here, you can see her prayer, the woman's prayer she was supposed to say while she was doing this. Master of the universe, although Eve ate from the tree of life, and therefore we today share her fate and have to suffer her sin and sometimes die, I promise you that if I had been there in Eden, I wouldn't have enjoyed the fruit. So we can see how Eve really becomes a very real figure here in their lives, and these women are speaking back with and towards Eve. And the other example I have, which is well known from the medieval period, but I only have an early modern illustration, is this picture of Jewish women giving birth. This is from a Hebraist text written by a Christian, actually a Jew who converted to Christianity. And what you can see here is the most common Jewish amulet used during birth. And that's what you see in the top part of the picture where it says, Adam, Chava, Chutz, Lilit. Adam and Eve, Lilith, stay away, if I had to translate it very freely. And Eve is considered a protector of Jewish women giving birth. So we can see how she figures once again in practice in this slide. So if I have to sum up and conclude now, what I would say is that by following these two examples, we can really see how these biblical figures are much more than just stories. They become explanations for practice. They become part of the practice itself. What I've tried to argue in some of my previous work is that these stories and the women's figures are especially important for understanding Jewish women's lives, because Jewish women didn't know the Talmud. They didn't know the complicated halachic legal writings. They did know the Bible. Learned men knew the Talmud, but most Jewish men didn't know the Talmud well. So actually by following the Bible and seeing how biblical precedents are brought, developed, and changed, we can learn a lot about medieval Jews' lives. But as I started and said, the Bible makes it more complicated because we also have to know how Christians around them were interpreting the Bible and to see how Jewish and Christian interpretations differ or the same. In many cases, what I've discovered is that the Jewish understandings often echo contemporary Christian understandings. Now, that's not all that surprising, because if we think what medieval Jews saw on the streets, the plays that were being enacted, the church windows, different sculptures, different artwork, they would have seen Christian interpretation as well. So in some cases, we can even understand if they absorbed these traditions. But the other point I want to make has to do with the other side of the story. I am not trying to argue that medieval Jews and Christians were the same, or even that they had the same beliefs and practices, even when they called on the same figures. Part of what was unique about medieval Jewish life was that Jews lived with their Christian neighbors, but they were still living apart. They were still a distinct minority. And what seems to me to be the most interesting part of this research is trying to understand how that all worked together, how they could be part of medieval life. And I think scholars of medieval Christianity have what to learn from what Jews are doing, but also how they made these stories theirs. They appropriated them or used their traditions to really firmly root them within Jewish culture. So what I've suggested to you today is perhaps in line with recent research on the Bible in medieval Christian scholarship. And I brought just two examples. My friend Eyal Peleg's wonderful volume about approaching the Bible in medieval England, where he talks about the Bible as an object, being used in oaths, being used in liturgy, and the fabulous volume that was produced by Susan Boynton and Diane Riley about the practice of the Bible in the Middle Ages. But what I'm asking to do, or rather suggesting that we can do, is take this a step further. Not just how the Bible was used in practice as an object, as an idea, but also how we can use readings of the Bible in order to understand practice, in my case, of Jews, and I'd be very, very interested in hearing of other examples you could bring from the cultures that you study. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everybody. Just like to thank Professor Baumgarten for an absolutely fascinating, stimulating lecture, and I'm sure it's provided us all with some food for thought. So if anybody has any questions from the floor there, we can open things up for discussion. So would anybody like to begin?
There.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so would you classify the marriage poem that you started off with as a piyut? And most of piyutim are like very much more high, fancy and very hard to understand. Why is it this particular one is not?
Okay, so as I said at the beginning, I think this is really an exception. That's why I was so thrilled to find it. I think kind of it snuck in to what these highbrow authors are writing down in their compendia. Mahzor Vitri is a compendium that tells about practice, but it's really written for the initiated. I mean, it's a student of Rashi's, writing for Rashi's other students, and it's very complicated, Mahzor Vitri. And most of the piyutim, most of the liturgical poems there are the complicated kind you're thinking of. I've actually gone through a lot of them over the past year, trying to understand what the marriage ones specifically have to say about marriage. There's a lot of Adam and Eve there. So that actually is similar between the different liturgical poems, but I think this was a kind of, almost a folkloric piyut that was sung in the synagogue. It was probably the most popular one because I found in different ritual books, now you sing this specific liturgical poem. So I think it actually was probably sung much more than some of the other ones. But it really is an exception, you're right. Maybe I'll just give a bibliographic reference. My colleague Kirsten Fudeman published Hebrew, very complicated liturgical poem that she found also in Old French. So what was really fascinating about that poem is it's one of two examples we have in which we have the poem both in Hebrew and in Old French. And what she tried to do, and that was very illuminating, is show what the differences are between them. And she showed how, I'd say, dirty the Hebrew poem was. Right? So the Hebrew poem was full of different sexual allusions and what the initiated men were supposed to understand. And the Old French poem was much cleaner. And if the women or the children were singing it, they wouldn't be getting all the dirty jokes. So that's actually an interesting example that goes in other interesting ways. So that's why I'm mentioning it. But I think you're right, and I agree with you completely, that this is very atypical. I said that at the beginning, and I wasn't talking tonight about why it's so atypical or why we have it, but I really think it's kind of an echo of what people are practicing, the kind of thing exactly I'm looking for, to try to get it into what a marriage ceremony like this looked. And I also just like the idea of kind of getting out of the text and thinking what people heard, what they saw. And that's why I wrote all the artwork tonight, not just so you could see a little bit of the medieval Jewish culture, but really so we could get our minds around, okay, if we want to talk about lived experience, what were these people seeing and hearing, and how did it make a difference? And I'll just add that I think stories are really crucial. I was very, very struck and really taken aback by Rachel Koopman's book. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's called Wonderful to Relate. It's about saints' tales in medieval England. And she talks there about the chattering environment and what people heard and how much of our lives are actually conducted by what we say orally, even today, but certainly in the medieval period. And I don't think anyone's really asked that question of the medieval Hebrew sources. So I'm trying to get at that question by looking at the stories and trying to hear what people were telling. So the story of the robe in there kind of would be an important into that kind of environment. Thank you.
Any other?
Thanks so much for that. It was wonderful. My question is about the images which were illuminating the various manuscripts you showed us. Can you say anything about the theology of images implicit in these? It would seem that the old idea of them being sort of a Bible for the unlearned or something like that wouldn't quite apply in these contexts because it's a very bookish context. Is there anything to be said about that? Or?
Okay, so I think we have to separate my answer into maybe two different parts. So the first thing is a theology of images. These images were probably made by Christians. In other words, a Jew would have been a scribe, let's say a Jew who was a scribe, for example, in this book, which I'm very familiar with, it's a very small, almost pocket Bible size, but it's got 760 pages, so it's very fat. It was probably made by a rich Jew, or commissioned by a rich Jew, who then would take it to the synagogue and share it with everyone in the synagogue and take it home at them. So it was a coffee table book that he brought to the synagogue and then brought home again, and it has really probably 24 gorgeous, beautiful pictures like this one here. What we know that the scribe did, because we can see it in some of the pages, is that he then went to a Christian who would illuminate it for him. And we have pages that are empty, so they left space for the decorations weren't put in. Some of the decorations were kind of dogs, apes, birds, all kinds of nature decorations, which I think are worth thinking about. So someone this morning was talking about apes, right? Right? You were talking about apes in the convents and the women who were in the different houses. So we have to think about what women are doing what apes are doing in these books in 13th century France. Oh, sorry about that one. But if we go back to your question, which I think is an excellent question, how much theology can we read into a Christian image? So in some cases we have instructions in the margins. Take a Virgin Mary holding the baby, so Madonna holding the baby, and draw King Solomon holding a Torah scroll. And you can see that it's exactly the same picture. Or a rabbi holding a child. So we actually have Christian images then being converted into Jewish images. That's really interesting. So some scholars have worked on that. In other cases, we can see they gave even more explicit instructions. And then you really have to know all the midrashim, the Talmudic stories, in order to understand what's going on in these pictures. And they're a commentary in and of themselves. So to understand that, you have to be very learned. I don't think that your ordinary Jew, even if they had this book in their hand, because everyone went to synagogue, so everyone could have looked at it. What is very interesting is the most often illustrated Hebrew books are Haggadot, which are used on Passover Eve. And actually my picture of Tzipporah and Moses, which you saw, comes from one of those Haggadot, it was at the beginning. Comes from, actually, let me just show you this picture for one more second, because it's a good example. Adam and Eve, very Christian Adam and Eve, from the same Hebrew compendium. The snake here has a head. That's a very Christian medieval figure. And we don't have it in other Jewish illustrations till the 13th century in northern France. So you can actually see how the Christian artist drew what he was used to drawing for Adam and Eve. And then underneath it, they just wrote, Ze Adam v'Chava, this is Adam and Eve, naked, and they have the tree of life and the snake with them. So that's what you see there underneath. So you can see a nice example of what I was talking about. Haggadot were used by all, and they were very often illuminated. So there we can really have the whole biblical story being played out, and I think you can learn a lot more from them. They're also much less highbrow, so much simpler. And we even have some that were done by almost lay people who are just sketching. So I think you can learn a lot more from them. So I think it really depends what art. Does that help?
So I was curious about Abraham being pulled out of the furnace. I just wonder if, given this back and forth between Christians and Jews, is there any connection to the harrowing of hell, where, Abraham, is there any connection there?
Okay, so I think that's a wonderful question, and that's a study that I've heard at least 4 colleagues say they were going to be conducting soon. So let me just explain what I mean by that. I think if we think of hell in medieval Christian Europe, and certainly in Northern Europe, we all think of purgatory, we'll all think of whether we like what Jacques Le Goff had to say or we don't like what he had to say, he certainly pointed us to a point in time when there's a lot of new thinking about sinning, about hell, about purgatory, and what goes on there. No one has really examined Jewish theories of, I would say, Eden or Gehenna, so either side of the coin, enough to really give an answer to that. But I would say, based on my readings and my colleagues who promised to do this study, perhaps we'll come up with some of these results, that we do have a new understanding of what happens in the afterlife. And perhaps the best example that this has been published on and studied has to do with how you save someone from the harrowing of hell or anything of that sort. And perhaps it's another reason why this story resonates. And I'll just say a word about that, which is that in Christian society, if you want to save someone, what do? You pay someone to say Mass, right? One of the ways of saving people is by paying for Masses. And that's a really common feature of medieval European life, and it's actually very important, right, economically and socially and religiously, and we can talk about it in so many different contexts. In Jewish society during the 12th century, in Mahzor Vitri, the same book I started with, a nice coincidence, we have the first explanation and really, I guess, allusion to what becomes a practice that even those of you who aren't that familiar with Judaism probably know, and that's the Kaddish said for the dead. So the Kaddish said for the dead is based on an old ancient prayer. Look at how complicated this gets once again. It's based on an old ancient prayer that was part of the liturgy service and is still said in different parts of the liturgy without any connection to the dead. So any Jewish service you go to will include a Kaddish at different places. But if you have someone who has a family member who died in the past 12 months, in the community, that person will say a special Kaddish for the dead in a special place. That also starts in the 12th century medieval Europe. So that's another nice example of a shared practice within a different belief system. And there's a story that goes along with that, so that's just to prove my point that stories often are so much more forceful than just having a new practice introduced, and that story is a very powerful story which remained really etched in collective memory. So I think that's perhaps a good example of what I'm trying to illuminate as well. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any other questions or observations, contributions? Okay, that's all right. Well, just by way of summation, I'd just like again to thank Elisheva for what was an absolutely fascinating lecture, and I think a very important one, particularly in terms of the actual possibility of kind of a recovery and a reconstruction of lay Jewish religiosity beyond these elite texts, which are so often the major focus, and indeed very much part of, I suppose, the program of Jewish studies set in motion by Salo Baron, moving beyond the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which I think is something that is, again, hugely important. So I think, thank you again, and we could all, if I could just ask you all to show your appreciation, Toda Rabba, to Professor Baumgartner, and thank you very much.